Good evening, everybody. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is a nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, and Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We are honored to be here tonight with our friends from the Auburn Avenue Research Library on African American culture and history to celebrate Stephanie Y. Evans' new book, Black Women's Yoga History, Memoirs of Mental Health and Wellness, which is hot off the press. And we are here with Layli Maparyan, who is one of our favorite old time Atlanta folks who we wish was still in Atlanta, but we are thrilled to see you digitally. We wish we were also physically in space together, but we're glad to be healthy digitally together. So, to all of you watching at home, I want to offer these folks' bios, and I want to let you know wherever you're watching from, we encourage you, please let us know what brought you here tonight in the chat. Feel free to ask questions in the chat or in the Ask a Question area at the bottom center of your screen. At any time, you can buy Black Women's Yoga History from Charis by clicking the teal button at the bottom center of your screen. It really does help us when you buy your event books directly from Charis. So I'm going to introduce Dr. Maparyan first. She is the Catherine Stone Kaufman Executive Director of the Wellesley Centers for Women and Professor and Chair of Africana Studies at Wellesley College. She has published 2 groundbreaking books in the field of womanist studies, namely The Womanist Reader and The Womanist Idea. And a 3rd book, Womanism Rising, is forthcoming. She is a current Fulbright specialist and has served previously as a Fulbright specialist at the University of Liberia, with other international projects in West Africa and India. Previously, she held a contemplative practice fellowship from the Center for Contemplative Mind in Society, which supported travel to Plum Village in France and the development of a signature course, Womanist Perspectives on Spiritual Activism. She sits on the board of directors of the Global Fund for Women and is an active member of the Baha'i Faith. So we are thrilled and honored to have you here tonight. And we are here to celebrate the work of Dr. Stephanie Y. Evans, who is a professor of Black Women's Studies and the director of the Institute for Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Georgia State University. Her research interest is Black women's intellectual history, specifically memoirs, mental health, and wellness. At Georgia State, she is an affiliate faculty in the Department of African American Studies, as well as in the Center for the Study of Stress, Trauma, and Resilience. She's the author of 3 books, Black Women's Yoga History, which we're celebrating tonight, Black Passports, Travel Memoirs as a Tool for Youth Empowerment, which came out from SUNY, and Black Women in the Ivory Tower, 1850 to 1954, an intellectual history, as well as lead co-editor of 4 books, including Black Women's Mental Health, Balancing Strength and Vulnerability, which is also a SUNY Press title. She's the editor of the Black Women's Wellness book series at SUNY Press, and her full portfolio is available online at professorevans.net. So we want to let folks know that our research librarian friends from Auburn Avenue are going to be dropping knowledge and supplementary materials in the chat. Just know you don't have to click them all at once. You can just leave them up there and visit at the end because there's a lot of stuff you're going to want to revisit. So I'm going to get out of the way. I know folks are very eager for this conversation. There's so much healing that is needed right now in the world, as we were talking about in the green room. So it's a real honor to have you both here tonight, and I'm so glad that you are well in spirit and in body and joining us tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. So here we are, Stephanie.
Hey, Layli. All right. So what our viewers don't know is that we've already had the book talk. So no, it is such a pleasure and an honor to be in your presence every time. I am so fortunate to be able to do so. You are such an inspiration. I mean, I think I should back up definitely and thank Charis Books for this opportunity. And of course, Auburn Avenue Research Library. Definite shout out to Jana Long from the Black Yoga Teachers, the fundamental group of Black Yoga Teachers, the alliance that is really, I think they have something coming up in the next few weeks. but she really was so gracious in writing the introduction for this book and really gave me a confidence that from someone who was not only a practitioner for 40 years, but an educator, that this book was worthwhile. But as you see, lately, you are all up in this book. You have been such an inspiration to me for such a long time that I'm just grateful to be, just to be here chatting.
Well, thank you, Stephanie. And I also want to give a big shout out to Charis, because Charis has been incredibly supportive of both of our careers as Black women scholars and writers, as womanist scholars, and, just in all the work that we've done, featuring our books, enable us to have conversations like these. And they're an institution, and there's just, I want to express my thanks and just say how much I miss you, Charis, up here. I miss you. I'm up in New England now. But it's great to be here. And I also, Stephanie, I really want this opportunity to say publicly how much I'm an admirer of you and your work. In one of our previous engagements at a conference, I told you that I think of you as an academic priestess, as this really, a healer who works through books and scholarship to do all the kinds of work that you talk about. I mean, I think of you as sort of like the empress of Black women's studies. And I'm incredibly inspired by your prolificness. I'm just like, Stephanie has another project. And it's not just books. You got websites, you got videos, you got conferences, you're just like best all around. And I am in awe. It's a privilege to have met you and known you. And in fact, sometimes I like to reflect back on when we met. I don't know if you remember, we met, you picked me up. I was coming to the University of Florida, and you were the person in charge of picking me up. And we had this great long car ride coming back from the airport. And we had like this real homegirl conversation. I had just met you and you had just met me, but we clicked instantly. And ever since that time, we've just sort of been, orbiting each other in some way. And that's been a really profound relationship. Like, we don't talk every day, but there has always been something about our relationship that is profound and sustaining since the day I met you. And I want the world to know that, because this is what, Black feminist and womanist friendship can look like. It's not work, and it's not terribly difficult, because there's a consistency of since we met. And I think we were on a panel too with Lee long time ago. Yeah, I think so.
Right? Remember? And it was just
at a school. Yeah, when your book first came out. Yep.
Yeah, it was very quick. We were just running back and forth and on the panel back in the olden days when outside was open. Yeah. But we have always just kind of crossed each other's paths. And then, of course, now I'm at Georgia State, and right after you had gone. Right. And but it's never been like a task, like, or you just, how you look at people like, oh, well, that was an interesting choice.
Yeah.
Not judging, but it's just kind of like, okay, well, maybe I need to take a step back from that person, or just kind of that feeling of, and I think we're too judgy in academia anyway. But we have, these high expectations, and we put people on a pedestal, and then we have these expectations, and then because of those expectations, we get disappointed. So I think there's just been this real vibe that it's like, Layli, Stephanie, like that's what it is. And there's been no time. I mean, and sometimes people have off days and things like that, but I just appreciate that every time we've interacted, it's been, people use the word authentic or organic, but it's been real roots, like real, very plain, real plain and rootsy. And I appreciate that.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you. Feelings mutual. So what are we going to talk about?
Oh, the book. Yes. So I wrote a book.
One of many.
Well, people comment on how productive I am, and I'm not productive. I'm curious. I write books about things that I want to know about. I know very little about yoga. When I started, I still know very little about yoga. I wrote a book to help me figure out the questions that I want to ask and the things that I want to discuss with people about yoga. Not because I'm in, if I waited until I was an expert in anything, I wouldn't have written a word. But yoga for me was of interest because I found it personally helpful. And in a time of dire need, when I started in writing this in 2013, it started with a miscarriage. And so, I married late and the eggs were just not, cooperating. And so it was devastating, but I really didn't give myself time to mourn because I was at Clark Atlanta. We were doing the Du Bois Conference, which is another place that we kind of interacted, right? And it was like a few weeks or a month right before the Du Bois Conference. And I just said, okay, can't deal with that. Got to do this. Did that. And then that summer, I was intensely depressed. And I was like, I wonder what's wrong with me. And then it was like, there was that whole life thing that happened that I didn't deal with. Whatever you don't deal with will come back. So that's when I started really thinking about moving from, questions of intellectual history and how Black women teach us about higher education to what Black women, and particularly Anna Julia Cooper, who everyone recognizes is just kind of this elder stateswoman, feminist womanist. And we'd always looked at her as a thinker. I asked the question, I was like, how the hell did she live to be 105 and a half? She lived to be 105 and a half, lived in her house, died in her house, in her sleep, at peace, after earning the PhD at the Sorbonne, raising 5 children that were not her own, under threat of being fired, like all of these things. And I've talked to her great nephews, 2 of her great nephews, and they said Sis Annie, they called her Sis Annie, would spend every morning in the sunroom writing. And and it's like, so that's like, she was a meditative writer. And when I went to the Howard Archives, the Moreland Spingarn, I saw poetry of hers, in her shaky handwriting. She was 98 years old writing, very spiritually based poems. And it was just like, okay, so I need to learn from the elders, not just about the ideas about how to be an exemplary scholar and an impactful scholar, but what that can do for me to teach us about health. And how to live in a sustainable way, dealing with the inevitable ups and downs and not being taken out for the count. And so yoga and meditation were the things that I had informally practiced for a long time that were the most helpful. And so that's how I started, discussing yoga.
And I can totally relate to that. Probably more on the meditation side than the yoga side. I've practiced yoga off and on, but I've had a more consistent and longer practice of meditation, different forms of meditation. And, just like you mentioned, the situation of your miscarriage, I think you and a lot of other people know that I experienced the death of my 22-year-old daughter. And if it weren't for the spiritual practices, most notably meditation and prayer, that were part of my life, I would have never made it through that situation, and it was only because of that I was able to, sort of have, I don't want to say equanimity, because no one really has equanimity at the loss of a child, as I'm sure you know, but just to be able to process it, and get through that experience, those things were extremely helpful. So, I can relate to what you're saying. And when you talk about Anna Julia Cooper being, a morning writer, I could relate. When I was on sabbatical, the first thing I wanted to do and the first thing I did was start a daily morning writing practice. It wasn't that it was new to me to do that, but I had been so busy in recent years that the practice had escaped me. And it was so rejuvenating to get back into it. It really was a centering practice. It really was something that made me such a more effective person in the world, to be able to collect myself that way in the morning. So, I totally, I totally relate to that theme.
Yeah, Jenna Long talks about observing her her grandmother and her mother in their morning practice. At the beginning of the book, where she writes, she just observed them in the morning, starting off with, basically peace and quiet, right? And that they would they would dissect the newspaper or the smell of coffee, a very sensually peaceful setting, right? And, talking to each other's in hushed tones, and that we have this idea of what yoga is, when in fact it's so much broader and so much deeper than it's portrayed commercially, right? That it's this, you have to be bendy, stretchy, acrobatic. And in fact, that's not it at all. When I started learning about yoga and in Kemetic yoga in particular, with your Sir Rahotep, that it really is kind of an ancient Egyptian practice in addition to an Indian practice. And so there were scholars that I learned from about Indian yoga, Rupa Singh, Rumia Pucha, Srina Gandhi, in particular, 3 Indian women scholars of yoga who, reading their work and having conversations with some of them, really helped me understand that it's not the commercial, thing that we see, that it's a very holistic practice of mind, body, and spirit, that, when we look at it in terms of Makeda, in East Africa, Makeda and her people bow down to greet the rising and setting sun. It was like, oh, that's a sun salutation.
Yes.
Okay. And Dr. Gail Parker's idea of restorative yoga. And there's all of these different types of yoga, the yoga of sleep and the yoga of rest, and in addition to the vigorous yoga that we see. And so I was very clear that what helped me most was very slow stretching. And I came to that because I was a dancer. My mother was a dancer. My grandmother was a dancer at Howard Theater. My grandfather was a showman at Howard Theater too. He did a routine where he tap danced on a 3x4 table blindfolded, like that was his act. So I like, yes. So I come from entertainers. Like, we grew up with jazz in the house, with entertainment, with joy and singing and all of that. And so we were very, active and creative and physical people. So when I took my first couple of yoga classes, it was this balance of like, oh, this is dance stretching. When you look historically, when you look at the Black practices and then the yoga history that I found, like in the 1970s, that it's really almost improvisational, I would say, how Black people have engaged, like with everything else, like find a way or make one, right? Clark Atlanta University, right? We gonna find a way or make a way. Yeah, that we've found a way or make a way, and add our own sauce to it in the meantime. But that there was this long history that, and that was the moment that snapped for me, was when I saw the Rosa Parks picture. It was like, oh, Parks. Never seen it. Haven't really thought about it. We need to understand what made Mrs. Parks, so clearly engaged in this practice.
Yeah. That was really a turning point when you found that picture and shared it, just to think about Black women's wellness in that context, and to understand that these practices had a much longer history, and in many respects, seemingly deeper and longer in our community than in the wider public. It was remarkable to discover that. In my own experience of yoga, I have very much experienced it as a self-knowledge practice. It's almost like the practice of yoga opens up parts of my brain and self-knowledge that only get unlocked when I'm in the practice of doing, whether it's the physical part, the mental part, but especially even just the stretching. If I'm stretching something that's not used to being stretching, something not just in my body, but in my mind opens up and gives me information. It helps me process experiences both recent and past. And, it's just an incredibly illuminating, and there's no way I could have known that from reading a book. I only could have known that from doing it. And I remember too, when I used to teach my womanist perspectives on spiritual activism class, we did some yoga in the class, you know, and it was really enjoyable to be in the classroom. And this was at Georgia State University, where every single class period, we did a meditative practice and a different kind. You know, the goal was to expose students to the wide smorgasbord of contemplative practices. And I remember it was tree pose that we did in the classroom, you know, and we you know, said, everybody, I want you to try this. And I said, I want you to notice what it's like, whether you've done this a million times or whether this is your first time hearing about it and doing it. I want you to notice what happens when you try it and what happens when you do it. What happens emotionally, what happens physically, what happens mentally, what happens spiritually, what happens environmentally. I want you to notice all those things. I just remember the students were laughing and, you know, blurting out what they were discovering. And, you know, just that one simple 10-minute exercise was so illuminating of the power of yoga.
Oh my gosh. Yes, I experienced it. You know, for me, I love the easy poses, like literally the easy pose, the logo pose, or what's in Kemetic yoga called Szechuan, right? Where you're just sitting with the writing pose, cross leg. Child's pose really blew my mind because, you know, part of the reason why I've been so attracted to yoga and meditation is to deal with the childhood trauma. That's why the miscarriage was devastating, but it took me back to being a survivor of many different types of violence. And that child's pose really, I mean, it opened up like just that whole chest breaker, you know, where you have to get into, you know, and I thought I would want to be a yoga instructor. I actually taught a couple classes and I was like, this can't be for me. Because there's so much stuff that I'm like, I just want to stay in this particular pose for 20 minutes.
Yeah.
And you can teach a class like that. That's not what people are coming for. You know, I really wanted to stay in child's pose. And, you know, that's my favorite. That and Savasana. Like just like
Savasana.
That's the hardest thing. Can you just, you know, that's the problem. Can you just lay with yourself? Can you sit still long enough and just be with yourself? That's a hard. Can you sit? You know, we've seen on social media. Go lay down. I'm gonna go lay down. Right? It's a whole spiritual now. Go lay down. Right? Just go. It's not necessarily even go sit down.
Right. It's go lay down.
Go lay down. And what that, you know, they got the nap ministry now, which I adore. It's that it's a very difficult thing to do to stop. And, you know, on the other hand, when I did start looking historically to what I'm calling historical wellness, I was shocked that it wasn't just Rosa Parks. You know, you see the pictures of the Delany sisters who were 101 and 102 in like inverted plow pose with one leg back here. I mean, and that they didn't start until 60. And then, you know, looking back at Harriet Jacobs and her meditative practice, and I even found a reference to Ursula de Jesus, who was an Afro-Peruvian mystic who, you know, wrote diaries, and she was talking about meditating on the sacrifice of Christ, meditating on Christ on the cross, you know, and, you know, there was just all these references, of course, Eartha Kitt, you know, and we've seen her in those poses, and it's like, and you know, and Jan Willis and Tina Turner, those are, you know, so I just kind of looked for those search narratives for any reference to meditation and yoga. I found about 150 meditation, 50 about yoga, and then of those selected those who were women who were over 70, right? So that we're looking at how it actually worked out in their bodies and their minds and their spirit. That's what yoga is as a holistic practice. And how they all, you know, literally embodied that to different degrees, but it was all very advanced and thoughtful. It wasn't just kind of accidentally and passive learning, as Fanny Jackson Coppin said, like, you know, there's passive learning, there's active learning. These weren't just women who received yoga passively and just kind of did it because it felt good. they really were practitioners. And Rosa Parks was actually teaching yoga in a church.
Right.
And so when I started giving these talks, there was a couple of young Black women in particular were saying, "Ooh, thank you," because my auntie and my grandmother, they're just like, "You doing that devil worship stuff, that is." And now they said, well, listen, if the deaconess Rosa Parks of the AME Church could not only take yoga but teaching yoga in the 70s, right after her 60th
What does
birthday,
that tell you?
What does that tell you? It's a whole different thing than what we thought it was.
Right. Well, it's great. And, it just shows that it's an active process of life integration. Like you said, it's about the balancing and the harmonization of the body, the mind, the heart, the spirit, the environment. All of those things are in a constant process of integration, which is we understand is like the central engine of like Black women's existence, which is this, how do we put things in balance, return things to balance for ourselves, for those around us, for the wider community, for humanity. It's like it's one example of a core practice to do that walk, and, it's amazing to me. I mean, there must be 200 at least women whose memoirs or life experiences you reference in this book with regard to the practices that are either explicitly yoga and meditation or reference it in some other way that makes it clear that that's what it is.
Yeah, I have to call out the name of John Jung too. He was my first research professor at Cal State Long Beach. And he was a psychologist who focused on the psychology of drinking and alcohol and substance abuse. And I was in the McNair program, the Ronald D. McNair program, which was, there's Upward Bound, which is designed to get high school students to the next level of college. But McNair taught college students how to be graduate students, right? And go to that next level. So John Jung taught this summer class, and I had the pleasure of working with him for 2 years. He just passed last week. But he went from being a psychologist to, once he retired, he started researching Chinese history. And so he was born in Macon, Georgia, and he wrote a book called Southern Fried Rice, where he started to investigate what it was like to be the only Chinese family in the Deep South, right, for 100 months.
Wow. And
so then he just got on this kick where he was recording his personal history and exposing this kind of Chinese American experience. And so he wrote about Chinese restaurants and Chinese laundries. And he just really impressed upon me the significance of data in research, right? And how important it is to have something, and I can name others like Kevin Quashie, who's a phenomenal scholar. He just wrote The Sovereignty of Quiet? Just amazing. People who have impressed, John Bracey, my other major professor in grad school, all kind of emphasize the importance of good data, right? Quality data in research, because, you got people popping off about a whole bunch of stuff. It's like they'll just get real fancy talking about, and what are you talking about exactly, right? But what I was frustrated with was how I had to run over here and get memoir and run over here and get, and I love how you really integrated deep reading and the womanist idea, right, of memoir. Darlene Clark Klein, also some very, scholars really get into life stories, but I was just frustrated having to go find them. So I created this database, Africana Memoirs, where I just compulsively started to gather any life writing by Black women, so like Black women in Indigenous women in Australia, Black German women, all over the continent, all over the Caribbean, like can we just have them all in one place? Because that is, our life stories are such rich data, and that I really don't like the fact that there's, not enough research done on our life writing. And so I compulsively created these databases. That's where all my websites come in. It's just like here, because we don't necessarily, there's the hashtag Cite Black Women. We don't necessarily do a good job of surveying, right? The literature review. I know some of my grad students, current and prior, are like starting to twitch because I see some of them online, and I'm like, remember that the literature review is not like cherry picking, right? Where you go and you're just like, oh, I think I'll take this book. I'll take. It's like, no, you've really got to demonstrate that you're engaged in a robust conversation and are at the very least aware of the existence of these stories,
right?
And so that's why I think I've taken such time to gather the library, a robust library, not because you have to read 500 books to know, but, you have to draw some significant cross-references. Like Maya Angelou wrote the introduction to Celia Cruz's memoir. I was like, what are you? It's like there's so many cool ways to see parallels to Black women's stories,
right?
And because we're not a monolith, to really see some striking differences,
right?
Only if you take time to really take our narrative seriously.
Right. And I think that that's one of the most important commitments of Africana studies, is to make sure that lesser known work by Africana authors gets not only cited, but collected, by pulled together. It's easy to cite the iconic canonical names over and over, but what about that deeper level of scholarship, and that's what I love about, your, as I say, your publications or your scholarly output, not just being books, but it's also things like these archives and these websites and, where you just gather stuff and you put it there for other people to use. That's a tremendous service. And now it's up to others to use that archive, and to do scholarship from that archive, and to make sure that when you're creating syllabi or literature reviews, that you are including these works. And, even in the book we're talking about today, Black Women's Yoga History, there's just such an overview of the content from so many different books that I hadn't even heard of half the books. The ones I had heard of, I probably read a few of them. So it's like, that kind of scholarship is tremendously important. It keeps us alive. It keeps these names, these stories, this work alive.
Yeah, bibliographies are really, really, really important for that reason, because it's to point to future. I can't do it all, and what I've done is just it's just like scratching the surface of the stories that need to be told. And it does feel at times that I am like compulsory, but as I say in this book, my grandmother told me I was a writer. And even through the darkest moments of, because it's not just about being an academic, we're writing to get tenure, we're writing to get promotion, we're writing to get this. It's like, no, we're writing to share ideas. And sometimes we get caught up so much in the professional aspect of it, the occupational aspect of it. We forget about the, as you so brilliantly ground us, like the spiritual aspect. What is writing doing for your spirit? I literally write by the spirit. I only write, after that first book, it's like, yeah, I got tenure, okay, and then I got promoted, and then, okay, great. It's literally like, I can't stop writing because I have a question about this, and after I have a question about it, I'm gonna go research and I'm gonna write it down. And for this moment, writing during a pandemic, I felt even more pressure to write about inner peace, which I thought was the stupidest thing I'd ever heard about when I was like, so you're really going to write about inner peace? That's just,
Mm-hmm.
there's nothing academic. Seriously, interview, and you're going
And
to
you
call
put your hand on your third eye, right? Okay.
seriously, like, but again, this is why I appreciate your work so much, because you do such a good job of showing what you call, right, everyday.
Mm.
These are everyday women stuff.
Mm-hmm.
It's everyday woman stuff. It's not, it doesn't matter your education, it doesn't matter your income, it doesn't matter how many followers you have on the gram, right, or the Twitter. This is everyday spirit work.
Yeah.
And when the pandemic hit, when the apocalypse happened, it just made it so much clearer. Like, I fear for my life. I fear for my life to this day.
Mm-hmm.
There are structures and individuals who do not value life.
Mm-hmm.
And I do.
Mm-hmm.
So writing about inner peace was really an act of resistance. Like, I don't know about y'all, but like Harriet Jacobs and Harriet Tubman, my life is worth more than a sixpence.
Mm-hmm.
And so the concept of inner peace is, very much rooted in public health, Billy Avery, Kamara Jones, right? This understanding that there's personal behaviors, there's social determinants of health, there's social determinants of equity, and they all, as you say, can be impacted by the spirit, by spirit work, right? That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, I mean, it gets to the heart of, what you say in the book and what others have said about Black women's studies existing to save Black women's lives. But then in turn, womanism is about taking what we've learned about how to save our own lives and helping all humanity save everybody's life. I mean, it's really about taking what we've learned through the kind of data that you're talking about, which is data from our everyday lives, data that other people overlook, overwrite, marginalize, dismiss, and saying, no, this is important. This is actually the secret sauce about living life well. And putting that on paper, making sure it's in the library, making sure it's online, making sure it's in academia and in courses, and not letting it be relegated to spheres where not everybody has access to it. It's that work, that's sort of the bigger project in all of this, and I think your intervention couldn't be more timely in the sense that, what this pandemic has really laid bare is how deeply and broadly and badly people are suffering. They're suffering from systemic conditions. They're suffering from spiritual decimation, and we have to stand up and tell the truth of what's going on. There are analyses that are really only skimming the surface of what people are experiencing. And this writing that you're doing and that I've done, and, it's really about speaking truth about what people are experiencing and figuring out how to turn the ship before, it's consumed in the tidal wave.
And I think for me, because I grew up, so I was born in Washington, D.C., and moved to 5 different places before I was a teenager because my wonderful stepfather was in the Air Force, and have moved around a lot since then. But in that moving, you see so much. But because I moved around so much, part of my educational experiences were interrupted because, like, every 2 years I was always a new kid, But and I did live in Germany for 3 years from ages 6 to 9, which gave me a whole different educational perspective. But I really didn't get a good grip of history, American history or world history. And there are people who have continuity in their education who still don't get, and that's a big fight right now. What history are we teaching? Is history important? What shouldn't we teach? What can't we teach? I went to middle school and high school in Arizona, right? And about a decade ago, they came up with House Bill 2281, which outlawed ethnic studies. So, what we're seeing now is not the first iteration of we are outlawing knowledge, right? We cannot teach this knowledge. But all that to say, I really didn't have a good sense of history. And when I started college, I started at St. John's College in Santa Fe, New Mexico, with the great books, right? And Homer and Aeschylus, we did Euclidean math. It was fabulous. And at one point, I saw a reference to Africans in Herodotus, the histories, and Thucydides, the Peloponnesian War. And I was like, oh my God, there's Africans. Can we talk about the Africans? And they were like, no, that's prehistory. And I was like,
oh, yes.
What in the, I can't cuss because this is a family show, is prehistory. Africa was relegated to prehistory, right?
Yeah.
Pre-civilization, which we all know started with Greece. And so it's just been important to me to learn as much about history from Black women's perspective, because it keeps me from being hopeless.
No, I understand. I understand you, and I know what it's like to really follow these clues and these breadcrumbs that we find in sort of the mainstream curricula that we're given, and then to go dig deeper and find the untold histories and bring them forth. I know what that experience is like and how liberating it is. I've had so many encounters with people that have no concept of some of the kinds of historical things that we're talking about. And, it's just, it's something.
That's why I write so much, because I'm like, I didn't know this. Did you know this?
Yeah,
and
right.
A whole bunch of people did know it, but there's a whole bunch of people who don't. And I'm talking to the people who don't, because I was one of those people.
Yeah. And I like to remember, the story of Milla Granson, although I know she's also known by other names, but a woman who learned to read and write while she was enslaved and started teaching others in her midnight school, and it always reminds me that you can never outlaw knowledge. You can never outlaw education, because you can hold class in your living room and nobody's going to stop you. So if the school isn't, doing what it needs to do, we can create our own spaces for doing it. And that's always true. That's always true. And there are times when we have to do that, for the survival of succeeding generations.
Yeah.
All right. So let's talk about historical wellness. Tell everybody what it means.
It's this idea that there are roadmaps to self-care, right? And wellness, as you say, like vitality. I'm interested not only in surviving, although there's some real interesting conversation about what it means to survive. And there's some scholars who kind of parse that out, the good and the bad of survival, right? It's not just survival, but what does it mean to thrive? So historical wellness is this question of what, in the Salt Eaters, right? Are you sure, sweetheart, you want to be well? What does it mean to interpret Black women's lives as wellness rather than illness? Because in my exploration of mental health, which, this is kind of a secondary book from an edited volume with Kanika Bell and Nasinga Burton, who are amazing scholars, a psychologist and a psychology professor and a media scholar, who we all teamed up and wrote, about Black women's mental health. This is a question of what does it mean to look at history and acknowledge the sacrifices of, and I'm slowing down here because I remember the trepidation and the care that I knew that I had to take, because I think about people like Fannie Lou Hamer, who gave herself for the struggle. So it wasn't, anybody think about no survival or, it's not about survival. It's about justice. And so how do you look at someone like Harriet Jacobs, who was enslaved and then, hid herself in an attic for 7 years, and tell the truth about slavery and tell the truth about her condition, but also tell the truth that she has something to tell us about, reading and writing in isolation for 7 years, watching her children grow up and strategizing to have enough conscience to write letters, give them to her grandmother to mail, like the letters were coming from the North. I mean, she was just a mastermind. 7 years in isolation. That's wellness to me. And so I am really mindful of and have such deep respect for like members, particularly of ASALH, the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, but also ABWH, the Association of Black Women Historians, because when you're sitting in archives that are literally filled with blood, right? It's just, I'm thinking of Deidre Cooper Owens' Medical Bondage in particular. The work that you have to do to uproot these stories and tell these stories of, the foundation of gynecology, like the painful work that I've seen Black women do to make sure that we don't forget is so important, that I want to preface what I do on wellness, that it could not exist without that history, right? Historical wellness means that we're not just saying, oh, look at all the fabulous Black women. Like, can we talk about the fabulous Black women and ignore all of the suffering? No, it's understanding that even the fabulous Black women were suffering in some way, but even those who we deem suffering have something to tell us that is intensely humane, humanistic. And this idea now of One Health that's gaining some steam, that it's not just human rights, right? It's the human and very much womanist, like it's the human and the spirit and the ether and the, and the connection and the ancestors and the tomorrow's children. It's this idea that there's something powerful about claiming wellness. That doesn't mean that it's a static, like I'm well and that's it. That doesn't mean that you don't have to fight for it or fight to keep it, but that we have a right to realize our fullest potential of joy. And that's part of the reason, I think, why Black women are despised so much, because we do joy like nobody else. Like, we can do the joy, And so for me, it's just finding, and I also talk about in the book, being a self-emancipated youth. So I moved out of my house at age 16. And it was challenging to piece myself together in the image of myself. So part of it, of gathering these voices, was to, kind of highlight my understanding that there's no one way to be a Black woman, and that there's so many, and I've had so many mentors, just healthy and joyful and filled with love, right? And you say that's the bottom of everything, right? Love,
right?
That it's possible.
I think I see at least two kinds of distinct narratives in your book about Black women's experience. One narrative, which you sort of begin with, is the narrative of people who have been deeply rearranged by traumatic experiences, sometimes violent, abusive experiences, but who make the discovery that wholeness is possible and move towards it in a variety of ways. And the other narrative is about women who, for whatever reason, often because of community norms and experiences, come with the understanding that despite society's attempts to destroy me, I'm indestructible. And both of those women manifest historical wellness in different and very illustrative ways that are so valuable today. They both offer us certain kinds of lessons that I would love to be able to expand, beyond the conversation that we're having right now, beyond the college classroom and the library bookshelf, about, what do communities need to do now to make sure that we are a strong bulwark against the kinds of assaults that are still unrelenting. And then the other thing is, what kinds of ways do we need to continue to show, particularly to young and vulnerable and recently traumatized people, that beacon of hope and transformation that is always there to follow and move towards? I feel like both of those things. And as we're talking, one of the things I'm thinking about the most is, how can we get some of the stories and the wisdom that you've distilled both in this book and in your archive to young women, high school age women, middle school age women, elementary school women, all the way down, as young as people are able to understand it, how can we begin to share these stories with them? Because I remember something that you cited from the preface to, and some of us were brave about how, we're writing this for everyday women who don't even read books. A lot of people don't read books, but that doesn't mean that this information isn't as essential, and so how do we broaden the conversation? I tend to think that's something that womanists do relatively well, because we don't necessarily feel that distinction between being bookish and not bookish people or whatever. Being in the academy doesn't make us feel separate from anybody else. But, we always have to be thinking, how can we be generative and in our special role, you as a writer and me, whatever it is I do, to make sure that we're always, connecting. We're connecting people with this, information that we have been privileged to immerse ourselves in.
Yeah, I think that's what makes me love the websites and the music videos.
Mm-hmm.
Since Black Women in the Ivory Tower,
mm-hmm.
I've created music videos for my books, just for me, because I think it's fun. But also because when I do give talks, when I first started, I was doing a lot of churches, a lot of elementary schools,
mm-hmm.
and I would just play the music video,
mm-hmm.
and it hit all of the, complex theoretical and the very detailed historical
mm-hmm.
and, all that. But it was like to Jill Scott, so let's take this long walk and talk about higher education and what,
mm-hmm.
And so for every book, and Maya Dyson, who's a local
mm-hmm.
artist who was a backup singer for India Ari, and is just like, she's just such a beautiful artist. I reached out to her and asked if I could use her song for this music video. So that's why I make the music videos, because ain't nobody gonna read this 450 page book, right? Like some people who are like, oh yeah, it's a good idea, but who's got that kind of time?
Right.
But when you have a beautiful artist that represents all of the work, like the ideas of the work, and there's a lot of musicians who do yoga, right? It just made sense for me to say, okay, here are all the main themes and the visuals. Like, I'm a very visual learner, so I love pictures and pictographs and all those things. So the idea of the music video, blending that, you can get into, and that's why I do all the websites, because it houses all of the other things that can reach audiences that the book cannot.
Right. Okay. So if I'm, in the audience and I'm a K through 12 teacher, or I'm a youth pastor, or I'm a community group, where can I find these videos? And,
Yeah. So go to professorevans.net. It's a resource website. And there's so for example, Black Passports was written for school teachers, right? So I took the curriculum for history, geography, writing, poetry, right? And said, okay, here's the curriculum. Here's how these travel narratives can help you advance the curriculum. And here's a global map where you can have people do, kids do assignments to say, this is the criteria to meet this learning objective, right? And like, if we just say, like, where in the world did Du Bois go? Or Catherine Dunham, right? Or Dizzy Gillespie. Those are the types of things that, that engage. For the yoga book, if you go to blackwomensyogahistory.net, which you can get to, professorevans.net has all of my little projects. But Black Women's Yoga History has all of the videos. Jana Long has a 30-minute documentary on the history of Black yoga, which is fantastic. I've bookmarked my favorite online yoga classes. So if you're like, oh, this is good. Okay, I've never really tried yoga, or I have, and I don't know who I'd like here's a list of some Black Yoga Teachers Alliance members and their YouTube videos. Here's a couple other lectures, and so for me, it's all about gathering the resources in one place that you get to play around in, and because then when I'm teaching, it's just like, okay, go to this page and here's all the things that you need, for whatever.
Don't forget your soup cookbook.
Oh, soup. Yes. Soup, girl. I don't even know right now. My mind is so stupid. It feels weird, and as we were saying earlier, like, I love talking to you because I got up this morning, I had food poisoning, I was feeling bad, and I just slept all day. But I'm just so grateful for how you operate, right? Because you just, like I said, you're you consistently, and because you're like, you're a writer, and whatever it is I do, what you do is embody and model what womanism is, because there's a whole bunch of people who write about psychology who are nuts. There's a whole bunch of people who write about Black studies who hate Black people. And there's a whole bunch of people in women's studies who are just anti everything, and it's like, so there's some difference in what some people write and some people do, and how they treat other people, and all of the things that you write in your books that are at once every day. And what your writing is so like, okay, what is that? Let me go look to the dictionary. What is that? Okay. And the deeply philosophical, ontological, epistemological, without being arrogant. Like, this is what it really means. Like, what you do is embody all of that. What that's the ideal, like what it should be like, that we need to continue to all work through. But I just love talking to you so much.
Well, I love talking to you too. It's funny, your story is making me think of something, because when I was writing, I can't remember anymore if it was the Womanist Reader or the Womanist Idea. And, the publisher was saying, can you make this a little more scholarly sounding? And my mother, he said, it sounds too everyday, right? And then I had my mom read it. My mom was like, this does not sound everyday. So like, here I was caught in the middle, trying to like satisfy both audiences. Neither one of them were completely happy. But, I totally get what you're saying. It's like, I feel like everything that you can write about, you can put it in this kind of language or that kind of language, or why not just do both, because you got your different audiences who need to hear it different ways for it to have its desired effect. So if you can, kind of, what do you call it, code shift like that, it's important. But at the same time, like you say, the realness is all within. It's based on my own life experiences. It's based on the audiences that, that I want to connect with, or what I'm trying to say that I haven't seen said before, or whatever. And you do the same thing, except you do it twice as fast and, 3 times as well and all of that. But like I said, you're my role model. So
that means the world to me. I know we're getting close to time. Are there questions, or?
I don't know. I guess we should look in the question box and see if there's anything. No, I don't see anything there.
No.
So.
Well, what I did want to touch on is to think about what this wellness work, right? Womanist wellness has to contribute to how we understand what Black women are going through now. We're catching hell. Like, and I have to shout out Annie Lee, because if you look back, there's Blue Monday. Annie Lee's the artist, from Alabama, born in Alabama, really from Chicago. And Annie Lee, she's amazing. And the Annie Lee Foundation, if you look up, I think it's AFL365.com, and support Annie Lee's legacy. Blue Monday, we've seen a lot of, and then My Cup Runneth Over. That those are the two images that, one artist drew both of those, and they were both self-portraits. One was when she worked for, and actually I'm going to be dropping off some of these posters to Charis books in the next week or so. So, and I'm working with Center for Black Women's Wellness to share some of that, the artwork there as well. But, you know, we're going through it in all sorts of work, education, at our damn jobs, in the Olympics. Like we're just going through it. So what's your take on what's happening, you know, kind of globally, but specifically for Black women?
Yeah, I mean, I like I said, I see two things going on. You know, one thing that's going on is that people are really suffering. But the second thing that's going on that's kind of new, especially with some of these young Black women, like, you know, the Naomi Osakas and Simone Biles of the world, is they're saying, I'm not okay. I'm not going to pretend I'm okay. I'm not going to kill myself pretending to be okay when I'm not okay. And y'all are just going to have to deal with that. You know, and that's a new kind of messaging. That's a new kind of messaging. And, you know, it's funny because, you know, my husband and I were having a conversation with the stuff that was going on in the Olympics around that. And I was like, you know, I'm old school. I can't even relate to what's going on. But at the same time, there's a certain level of like admiration that these people can be so honest, you know, because I come from the old school, you know, strong Black woman, keep moving, you know, power through in that. And, you know, at the same time, where I think I've sort of evolved from that is that at least I can see when I'm going too far. I need to pause. I need to rest. I need to stop. I need to do what your book says, which is, you know, take that quiet time and do my journaling and my yoga and get myself situated. But the level of taking it to the public and the most high stakes moment, I'm not there. That's new, you know. But at the same time, it's forcing us to deal, and not just deal in our private lives, but deal as a society, which I think in the end is going to be healthy. You know, as long as the people who are doing that don't get killed by like the demonization of the media. You know, I mean, that's the risk. So there have to be people who are standing up behind them and saying, wait, let's take a look at it. And when you take a look at it, then you have to look at all those systemic factors that are shaping that moment of unwellness. And that's where I feel my calling to be like, let's not put this as a personal failure. Let's put this as a systemic situation that has created a moment of truth telling. But what
Absolutely. You know, I'm thinking, you know, I've situated my work in most recently in public health, because you'll see this other picture back here, Billie Avery. You know, I had the good fortune to meet her once, but I've looked at all of her videos, you know, and that's another way to really reach, you know, audiences. Billie Avery said no is a complete sentence.
That's a powerful
And
thing.
I was like, because, you know, we're like, no, but no, if I could, or no, but, you know, and so she is what I see coming back around, and more quickly and definitively, as you pointed out, is the willingness to just say, no, I'm not doing that, you know. But it's a balance, because I think about Allison Felix too, right? Who's now the most decorated. But you just see you see this trajectory of how we, not just in sports or entertainment, but it's kind of reflected there on the big stage, that we see at our jobs. We're always, oh, you're the one who can do it. We're so glad that you're in charge, because, you know, this is my 12th and final year as department chair in a row. Like, and it's kind of like the responsibility of caring and being efficient and being on, and no, you can't say no. Not only is it your job, but no matter where we are or what we do, it's this expectation that we will come through for our families. This is what Audre Lorde was saying in the beginning. We often quote the, you know, self-care is political, but that first quote that she wrote about compassion, that, you know, Black women show compassion for everybody else, for everybody that we have at our job, for our family, for our partners. Do you show compassion to yourself? And I think that what we're seeing is, regardless of how you finish or if you finish, that these are all, you know, Nicole Hannah-Jones, you know, you're making decisions where I'm showing compassion to myself. As Billie Avery said, like, I'm listening to my inner voice,
Mm-hmm.
right? I'm pairing what's going on intellectually with my gut.
Right.
And I'm blown away and very much impressed as well.
Yeah, and it's like saying, I'm in touch with my true identity. I'm not my medals. I'm not my publications. I'm not my kids' accomplishments. I am this spiritual being. I am that inner voice. I am, that. That's a different answer. I noticed that we have a question in the question area now.
Oh, okay. And
So,
I think we're at time. So,
yep.
But I guess we can do this one.
Okay, go ahead.
I have a question. In your research, what is something that completely surprised you that you were not expecting to find? I often have said that it's a Rosa Parks picture for me. Like, what? That just, but something just popped into my mind. I was really impressed. Let me see if I can find the quote. I was surprised and impressed by a lot of things, but I won't look for it. Jesse Norman, whose autobiography, Stand Up Straight and Sing, Jesse Norman from Macon, Georgia, who is just talk about like statuesque, amazing opera singer. When I started looking for yoga in her work, she was an active practitioner of Hatha yoga, and her, like Shirley Verrett, another Black woman opera singer, talked about how, teaching Pavarotti yoga stretches, because here she is in her diva, like ball gown, and then she's bending over and stretching, and Pavarotti comes over like, what are you doing? She's like, it's yoga. It's for the breath.
That was a great story.
And so then like all of these like opera singers in formal gear are like bending over and doing a pre-opera yoga class. But reading Jesse Norman's autobiography was so beautiful because she started out as pre-med, and she talks about growing up in Macon. She talks about incidences of them, like the youth marches and someone running into the sidewalk trying to plow over the youth march. Like, sound familiar? So the discrimination that she faced in the opera world, but just growing up in the South. But the way that she talked about yoga and her understanding of it as a spiritual practice that also was deeply rooted in her understanding of anatomy was fascinating.
That was.
Yeah, she talked about how she was taught at Howard University by her faculty member that, there's this training technique to breathe that you can emit this powerful sound without blowing a match out in front of you, right? And then she talked about the nasal cavity. Like, this was her instrument, right? She talked about the nasal cavity, the formation of the mouth, if you have teeth removed, how that impacts your sound, what the lungs do, and why Hatha yoga was so helpful for her, but physically. But then when she was in high stress situations, like singing for Jackie O's funeral, right? Where it was just like it helped her focus and really just be present and be there. And so I think that was just a beautiful surprise. And of course, Alice Walker and Angela Davis and Sonia Sanchez, women of the South. We think like when you hear yoga and meditation, well, that's some old hippie California stuff, but these are Southern Black women who have these practices. And so it was just kind of like, But Jesse Norman just took me out, man.
Yeah, that was a great anecdote. I remember that. Wow.
So, okay, this is the last question. I know we're over time. We're 9 minutes over time. Okay. This is the last question, I promise. You raise an interesting point because I'm sometimes feeling dismayed when it seems like fragility. How do we help them balance healthy self-care? Well, I think Layli, you really nailed the kind of two narratives, because when I sent Jane along the manuscript, to review, she was like, I really appreciate your story, but that trauma is not my story. And so there are some women who come to wholeness through an understanding of trauma. And then there's some women who come through wholeness through an understanding of wholeness, right? Being raised in that way. So I think it's just understanding that there is no one way to come to wholeness. There's no one way to do self-care. No matter what you do, you're going to be criticized for it and chastised that you're not taking care of somebody else. And that there's going to be ebbs and flows. It's a process. It's a learning. Everything is a process. And that's why I think looking at elder memoirs, 70, 80, 90, not just because I just turned 50 a couple of years ago, but it really is like, what does it mean to live long and well? And it doesn't look the same for any of them. Any of the centenarians that I study, none of their stories look the exact same. There's no magic bullet, like if you do this, then you're going to live to be 100, because not everybody's going to live to be 100 anyway. Not everyone wants to live to be 100. But I do think that it's just understanding that it's about process.
And I think I would add to that too, that there's some intergenerational reweaving and healing that we also need to do, because I feel like that the current social situation in some respects is unraveling family ties across generations in a way that young people need to be able to learn from the elders, and the elders need to stay connected to the reality of the young people so that there can be conversations in which these understandings about historical wellness can be communicated. I often find, and maybe this is because I still have teenagers in my house, that the young people feel very disconnected from the experience of the elders and not much interested in it. And I think it's different now than it was even in my own generation and in generations before. So I just think it's something to think about. Are we keeping our generations interwoven?
In the family and in the classroom, and just
right.
in the families we create. I think this has been beautiful. This has been beautiful and helpful, and this is what the book is about. It's going to take some time to unpack it. Like, it takes me a long time to write something. I write it, and then it takes me the rest of my life to learn from it.
Yeah, and I think there's 100 and a million book groups. Have you shown the book? This is what the book looks like.
Listen. We should probably do. Yes,
there it is.
Yes,
and it's a great book group book. I mean, you could make like a year of book groups out of just this book, and it's a great conversation starter. It's touching on things that all the Black women I know are dealing with. So, very timely. Just want to say that. Thank you.
Thank you so much to both of you, and thanks to everybody in the audience for watching and for offering your comments and questions. Please do click this teal button at the bottom center of your screen to buy Black Women's Yoga History from Charis. It really does help us. And it helps get the word out as well. We want to get this on our bestseller list because it means it will get seen by more people at Charis and around the country. Thank you to Auburn Avenue Research Library for being with us always and for always sharing such amazing resources. Remember that you can go back and click any of these links. These will stay up just in perpetuity. You can visit as many times as you like. I'll also be adding captions and putting this up on our YouTube channel in the next couple of days. Our YouTube channel is just YouTube.com/Charis Circle. So visit us there. Check out our deep archive of all the stuff we've been doing in the pandemic. There's lots of great stuff there. And finally, thank you to you both. I know many people are going to benefit from this resource and from this wonderful conversation. So I hope that you both stay safe and well, and that we can host you physically in the space sometime soon.
Thank you, Ar. Appreciate it.